Hi there. So I just want to walk through my new device, data.mod. If you know my other device, data.train, this is very similar. This whole section is basically the same. Um, and the difference is that instead of this modulating a sample mangler, you instead get these modulations and are able to map them to any parameter in live. So it's like a modulator version of data.train. If you don't know data.train, I'm going to explain it all now, and most of the time will be spent in this modulation section. So yeah, I'll explain the concept of how it works, and then I'll go through each parameter and explain each one. So how this works is it kind of centers around this whole thing here. And this is basically a system I made that creates these changes in values or modulations, I guess, if applied to a parameter. And yeah, so how does this all work? Well, there's 8 columns here, and then there's rows here in this little matrix kind of thing. And each one of these columns is a modulation source or value. And if we even go to this section, we can see there are 8 values to be mapped, and many of them are moving around. So these 8 values to be mapped mirror these 8 columns, and they're even numbered the same. Great. So you can also maybe notice that these multi-sliders here are jumping around, and those movements match each of these kind of scopes here. So these multi-sliders are also associated with each column. There's 8 of them. Okay, so how do we get these values to move around like this, and what's going on? So what's going on is that there's a certain frame rate that the values change. And if we notice right here, it says rate. So if I turn that rate interval down, we can see they're jumping around a lot faster now. And if I turn it up, they're jumping around, at about half a second now. So this controls the frame rate. So each of these values get a new value. So how do they get a new value? That deals with the kind of rows aspect of this. So you'll see here on the right side, next to each row, there's a little kind of math operator or symbol. So some of them might be obvious, like this one's minus, plus, divide, multiply. I'll explain the other ones once we get a better grasp of what's going on here. So now I'm going to turn these all to the bottom, pass, which means that they just pass and that they don't change. So notice the values aren't changing now. And let's just focus on the very first column. I'm going to touch these values just to reset them. Okay, so let me set the first value to plus. And you see, again, it's moving. Now, what's happening here is that the current value of 1 is being plus, is added by another value to get its next value. So what is the value it's being added by each frame that's making it change? Well, that value is set down here in the operand section. And if we open this, we see there's options of left, right, op, self, index. So right now it's on left. Let's change it to right. Okay, so right now the operand is set to right. And what that means is that for this example, number 1, it's set to plus. So that means that this value is going to be added by the value to the right of it to get the next value. And that value is this one, number 2. So let me set number 2 to be a low positive value. Now we can see that number 1 is just slowly adding up each frame until it gets to the top and it wraps around to the bottom. Now, just to let you know, these multi-sliders are bipolar. So in the center is 0, on the top is 1, and on the bottom is -1. So if value 1 is being added to value 2 every frame, value 2, value 2 is at a low positive value. Remember, if this is 0, maybe I can get it to be 0, I'm not sure. Oh, almost had it. Well, sorry, I changed number 1. Sorry, that must have been confusing. Okay, well, it's almost 0, but it's a little bit positive. So you can see that value 1 is very creepily getting added by a little bit each frame, and that's because 2 is set to a slight positive value. If I set 2 to a negative value, now 1 is going down because it's being added by the negative value of 2. I'm hoping that makes sense to you. So once again, to reiterate, value number 1 is set to addition. That means it's going to be added by a value every frame. And the value it's getting added by is set here by operand, which is to the right. So if I do a similar thing for value 2, let's set value 2 also to plus. So right now, value 2 is being added to value 3, which isn't changing. And value 3 is a slight positive value. So value 2 is just going up and up and up and up until it wraps around. And then value 1 is still being added to value 2 every frame, but value 2 is changing. So if we look here at the far right, there's kind of a history, and we can see value 2 is just ramping up. But we can see value 1 is doing a more complicated modulation. It's jumping around here and then this little arc. So yeah, that's kind of how this device works. You set up some kind of system or some kind of situation here, and you can get anything from very simple to complex modulations. And if I just kind of randomly set these to different things, we can see there's a lot more complexity happening here. If I changed operand to left, there's a lot of, it changes it all. So yeah, there's a lot you can do with this. So that's the overall concept of the device. You just set up a certain situation with these operators, and you get a certain set of modulations that happen. And of course, you can smooth those all out with glide, so then you don't just have a bunch of jumping values. And yeah, if we look in here, we see all these values are changing and ready to be mapped. Okay, so now that I've explained the general concept, I'm going to go through each parameter and explain it more in detail. So up here at the top left is run, so this just has it run or not. Below that, we've already discussed the frame rate, which is in milliseconds, but you can set it in synced intervals, but you got to run the transport. So now it's in quarter notes, eighth notes. Let me go back to quarter. This button will make it so that it locks to the transport. So even if you're in these milliseconds, if this is on, it's locked to the transport unless you run it. Random, I'm not going to press it right now, but this will randomize all these values here, which sometimes works out well and sometimes needs a little tweaking. Okay, down here is snapshots, so I could store all these parameters into a snapshot. So I'll press store, and now they're all stored in snapshot 1. And if I go now to snapshot 2, let me try randomizing now. Okay, so I just randomized it, and we have a random thing happening. Let's store that in snapshot 2. Now if I go back to 1, it loads us back to what was happening before. And if I go to 2, it goes to 2, and so on and so forth. Okay, so yeah, and snapshots cool. Like I was doing with some of the presets, you can store a bunch of patterns and then just switch between the snapshots, and actually you get some really cool different complexity in these modulation sequences, like for a song or whatever. Instead of having to modulate all these parameters, you can just modulate the snapshots. Or automate, of course. Okay, so let's go to this row. So reinit. So let me stop running this for a second. If I move one of these, you see how, okay, if I run them, do you see how there's like the multi-sliders and then there's these little dashed lines? The multi-sliders themselves denote the initial position of the values, and the little dashed lines just denote the current values, and that's why they're the moving ones. So if I move a multi-slider, it will set them all back to the initial position. So if I wanted that all to start like this, I could have them all start like this, etc. So if you press reinit, it will just snap them back to those initial positions. Now, if you press enable auto reinit, this reinitializes the values at a certain interval set here. So right now, every 1 bar, it reinitializes the values to there. And that can be also in milliseconds. As you can see now, it's just jumping back to them every 200 milliseconds. All right, so let me turn auto reinit off. Now we have glide, which I just kind of showed you before. Gives a little glide to the values. You can always do a synced glide, and yeah, matching these two rates is nice. So now it will perfectly go. But if you want to even round that off a little so it doesn't even reach the destination, you can do a little less glide or longer glide than the actual rate, or whatever you come up with. Okay, now back to the operand. So yeah, I explained the operand a bit, and left and right is pretty obvious. By the way, if it's set to say left, the left value of column 1 is column 8, so it just wraps around, and if it was right, it would wrap around the other way. Okay, the other options are op, and let me turn glide off for a second. So yeah, let me try to explain and show you op. So what op says is that since let's say these two, value 1 and 3, they're set to plus, and what op does is it adds the value by the last resulting value of the same operator. That's a little bit of a mouthful. So if there are these 3 values set to plus, I'm pretty sure that the value that 1, 2, and 5 will get added to is probably the last value of 5, because 5 is from left to right the last similar operator of all of them. And if 2, 4, and 6 were minus, now 2, 4, and 6 will get subtracted by the last resulting value of 6. So that's how op works, and it adds some more complexity in this whole system. Sorry, there's some kind of ringing sound at the tail of my voice. I don't know how to get rid of it right now. I'm sorry. Okay, so the other options are self, and so that will just add the value by itself. So or add or subtract or whatever. So if I pass these all, and let's just focus on 1. So 1 is just going to get added to 1 each frame. So that's what self means. And 2 will get subtracted by 2. And so if you do self and subtraction, it's just going to go back to 0. So some of these don't really work with self unless you want just a jump or something, like divide. And I think for self, the best one is add. But you can play around with the auto reinit and stuff, and maybe you can find other things other than that work well. Index. So if operand set to index, then the values are added, subtracted, divided, etc. by a set index. So if I set this to number I'll set this to number 7, which is a slight negative value. And now, so if I set all the rest to add, now they're just going to be added by 7, which is a slight negative value. So they're all just going down. And if I increase 7's negativity, now they're going down faster. And positive, now they're going up. All right, so that's the different operand options. Okay, and I explained what the multi-sliders do. Now I'm going to explain the other options here. Well, you multiply, divide, plus, subtract is pretty obvious. Pass, I think I explained, just passes the value. It doesn't change. Okay, this one, negative x, so that will just negate the value. So if I sent 1 to here, we can see it's just going between the positive and negative. And if we go to this, we can see it's just like a square wave going from the positive and a negative. And then question mark is just a random value. So now it just chooses a random value each time. Okay, so that's all the operands. Okay, as I kind of touched on before, this whole thing over here is a histogram, or a history of the values. So we can see this is just the history of the values over 32 steps, and you can decrease that history amount or increase it. So let me say I set it to like 4, or 4. Now it's just, let me do 8. So now we just see the history of the last 8 values. Okay, a cool thing you can do with this is press loop. And when you press loop, it actually just ignores this whole system and it just loops the last values of the history. So in this case, there are 8 values. So now it's just looping the last 8 values. Once they get to the bottom row, that goes back to the top. And you can choose if the loop's just normal, forward, or in reverse, or back and forth. And yeah, so this way you could actually just loop little sequences and they'll be more just like a looped rhythm. So that's this whole modulation section, which is the bulk of the device. Let me turn off loop, and when you turn off loop, it just goes back to following this system. So the other section, of course, as I mentioned, is the map. So here I have a filter, and let's say I want to just map this to the filter value. It works just like every other modulator. You press map, and it blinks, and this is the value that's going to get mapped, and then you just click a parameter, a mappable parameter in Ableton, and I'll just choose the panning, and it will map it to that. And if I play a little sample, let me do this. And then you can change the range. Sorry, let me turn this down. And then you can change the range just like every other kind of modulator device in Ableton. So I can increase the low range and high range here, 16 to 92%. If you want to unmap a value, you can just press this X button, just like every other modulator unmaps it. And this is the scope, so you can just see the scope of it. Let me turn this up. Okay, okay, one thing I won't be able to show you in here because we're in live 10 right now, and this only works in live 12, is if you press this R button, and it just won't work. And if you press R, it actually toggles to M, which doesn't even show here because it's not in the version. And what M is the modulate mode. So if you've been keeping track in live 12, now you can modulate parameters. Like you see how when I map these, it just took over the whole value and I can't move it. That's like the classic remote modulation mode. But if you go to this mode, we can't do it because we're not in live 12, but it would instead modulate the value relative to the center position, and then you just choose the amount you want it to modulate, and you can set it from being bipolar to just additive, and you can also do negative values to invert the modulation range. So this works a bit more like a traditional modulator. But again, I can't show you it here. It's really easy. Just if you have Live 12, just press that button and you'll be in the other modulation mode instead of the takeover remote mode. Okay, so I think that sums up the whole device. Let me know if you have questions. Hope you enjoy it. You can really throw it in our effect racks or instrument racks or whatever and do some really cool stuff with it. Thanks.